Coming to you live from Angkasa Puri, I'm Brendan Nepal.
And I'm Shuhaida Arifin. You're watching Special Budget 2023 edition of News at 10. Making the headlines tonight. Responsive, responsible and reformist. Government unveils Budget 2023.
And over 55 billion ringgit announced to mitigate high living costs.
The government today unveiled the anticipated Budget 2023 at a special parliamentary sitting carrying the theme of Keluarga Malaysia Makmur Bersama, driven by three agenda, namely responsive, responsible and reformist. Tabled by Finance Minister Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Tunku Abdul Aziz, the supply bill aims to protect Keluarga Malaysia's welfare, businesses' sustainability, harmonious economy and ensure effective government service delivery.
Bajet 2023 akan segera responsif kepada sebarang cabaran dan menyedia bantuan yang komprehensif kepada keluarga Malaysia, bukan sekadar kumpulan B40 tetapi juga M40, wanita, belia, OKU dan semua segmen masyarakat. Bajet 2023 bertanggungjawab untuk mengimbangi dasar fiskal yang mengembang dengan melaksanakan pembaruan fiskal ke arah kemampanan kewangan kerajaan dalam jangka panjang. Bajet 2023 ialah reformis yang mengambil peluang merubah lanskap pembangunan negara agar lebih inklusif dan mampan di samping membina industri negara yang kukuh melalui pelaburan strategik.
In gathering input for Budget 2023, the government had issued 6 public consultation papers and conducted numerous engagement sessions to come up with a holistic approach in realising over 100 initiatives for Keluarga Malaysia. The budget also saw a record high of 372.34 billion ringgit allocated for federal spending plan next year, surpassing previous budget by 40 billion ringgit.
Bajet 2023 yang tiada seumpamanya akan memperuntukkan sejumlah 372.3 bilion ringgit. Ini merupakan peningkatan yang ketara berbanding peruntukan bajet 2022 sebanyak 332 bilion ringgit dan bajet 2021 berjumlah 322 bilion ringgit. Dicadangkan, bajet ini menyediakan 272.3 bilion ringgit bagi belanja mengurus, 95 bilion ringgit untuk belanja pembangunan dan 5 bilion ringgit di bawah kumpulan wang COVID-19. Sejumlah 2 bilion ringgit disediakan sebagai simpanan luar jangka.
Malaysia's economic growth outlook in 2023 remains positive despite global headwinds such as inflationary pressures, economic uncertainties, tightening of monetary policy and weak global economic growth prospect as projected by International Monetary Fund. Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul said the government will continue high fiscal support and adopt an expansionary fiscal stance to spur domestic economic activity in sustaining the gross domestic product growth momentum, which is forecast at between 4% and 5% in 2023.
Bermula dengan pengkucupan 4.5% pada suku ketiga 2021, ekonomi negara telah kembali berkembang 3.6% bagi suku keempat 2021, terus mengukuh 5% pada suku pertama 2022 dan kini melonjak 8.9% bagi suku kedua 2022. Pertumbuhan suku kedua tahun ini merupakan pencapaian terbaik di Asia Tenggara. Momentum pertumbuhan ekonomi dijangka berterusan, malah lebih mengukuh bagi suku ketiga 2022. Sebagai sebuah negara yang mengamalkan ekonomi terbuka, Malaysia tidak boleh lari daripada tempias perkembangan global yang kian mencabar.
An allocation of more than 55 billion ringgit has also been set aside under the 2023 budget specifically for subsidies, financial assistance and incentives to minimize the people's cost of living through goods and services price control. Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul said 200 million ringgit was allocated to cover the cost of transportation and distribution of essential items to ensure they reach the rural residents at reasonable prices. He said the benefits of the program will be extended to 23 new areas in Sabah and Sarawak. Looking at the positive impact of the Jualan Murah Keluarga Malaysia program on B40 households, the government will also continue implementing it nationwide, covering 600 state constituencies, 13 parliamentary constituencies in federal territories and public universities with an allocation of 100 million ringgit. On a related note, Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul said households with monthly income less than 2,500 ringgit and have 5 or more children will be eligible to receive 2,500 ringgit in Bantuan Keluarga Malaysia BKM. He said the new category is an effort of the government to lighten the burden of families with many children. Households with up to 4 children will be eligible to receive BKM ranging between 1,000 to 2,000 ringgit. Households with income between 2,500 and 5,000 ringgit will receive between 500 to 1,000 ringgit in BKM depending on the number of the children.
Kepada warga emas tiada pasangan serta golongan bujang pula, mereka akan terus menerima BKM masing-masing sebanyak RM600 dan RM350 bergantung kepada had pendapatan tertentu. Tahun 2023, bantuan tambahan RM500 kepada ibu atau bapa tunggal yang mempunyai anak tanggungan akan diteruskan. Ini bermakna ibu atau bapa tunggal layak menerima bantuan maksimum sehingga RM3,000. Kadar BKM maksimum ini meningkat berbanding RM2,500 tahun ini.
Prime Minister Datuk Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob describes Budget 2023 as an inclusive budget for all levels of Keluarga Malaysia that focuses on all strata of society, including the B40 and M40 groups, youths, women and persons with disabilities. He said the allocations in the budget are also oriented towards meeting the needs of people in both urban and rural areas.
Saya gembira dengan bajet yang dibentangkan kerana bersesuaian dengan tema keluarga bajet ini, iaitu Keluarga Malaysia Makmur Bersama. Jadi bajet ini mencakupi semua. Bukan saja dari segi kumpulan-kumpulan kumpulan tertentu dikhususkan dengan di bawah tajuk-tajuk tertentu, seperti kumpulan B40. Dan selama ini ramai yang menganggap kumpulan M40 ditinggalkan di dalam bajet. Tahun ini diperjelaskan, banyak perkara yang melibatkan M40 juga. Begitu juga dengan kumpulan belia wanita. Banyak tahun ini, bukan saja dari segi menjaga kebajikan mereka, tapi dari segi perniagaan dan sebagainya. Begitu juga dengan belia kumpulan komuniti perniagaan juga banyak yang disebutkan tadi, terutamanya dari segi PMKS dan sebagainya, program untuk industri bagi memulihkan ekonomi yang kita tahu tahun depan mungkin agak ada ketidaktentuan dari segi ekonomi, juga diberikan fokus di dalam bajet kali ini. Jadi bajet kali ini direct kepada rakyat, komuniti perniagaan, pemulihan ekonomi dan sebagainya.
All right, now to understand this further, we have invited an esteemed economist to explain more and provide his point of views. Passing it to Brandon, who will lead us in this interview.
Thank you, Shuhaida. And just to highlight the aforementioned, the government has allocated a whopping 372.34 billion ringgit for next year's federal spending. Now, to dive in with me today, please welcome University of Malaya's Professor of Economics, Dato Professor Dr. Raja Rasya. Welcome to the show, Prof.
Thank you, Brandon.
How are you doing?
Not too bad.
So you heard the budget 2023, which was tabled by Finance Minister. So are you pleased with the budget?
I think in the circumstances we are facing, on the one hand, it looks good because you are aware that there are people suffering, especially the poor, and that the economy needs to move. For the 2 years before, we've had a situation where even though we tried fiscal policy, but much of it was leaking because of the fact that we had this pandemic.
Right.
Closures, tourism was down,
Right.
flight transport, a lot of sectors were affected, so it wasn't tangibly producing any results. But this is the time, I suppose, to move on, except that there's some concerns, and I'm not sure if others will have the same. How do we meet this additional budgets and the form with which it's taking, that it doesn't exacerbate inflation, especially food inflation?
Right. Now, in a nutshell, Prof, 2023 budget, we are here today. Is this an election budget, or do you think this is a people's budget?
I remember coming to studios, not just here, to every other studios.
Right.
Every time we have this assertion that it's a historic budget because it's the biggest, but you expect that to be big because GDP grows, I mean, we're talking about every year. Unless you have a contraction in GDP, and perhaps at that time we could possibly look at a contracting budget. But remember that whenever you face a crisis, you want to do that much more, and therefore it's never been the case. So I like to take from there, and then at the same time see what we can do out of this, rather than conjecture on something that has already happened. And I think it's a good starting point.
Right. Now, just to dive in even deeper with this budget, how can this reflect the country's development in terms of economic recovery? So is there an element of overspending that might actually just compromise the whole of budget 2023?
My feeling is it comes out well in addressing the plight of the poor at this time. You have either a group of people who are given overtures by way of government spending, those families with incomes less than 2,500, you give an additional 2,500. Likewise, teachers given additional salary perks. So many things in that sort of way. And also you have the other one, which the government doesn't bear directly, but indirectly it does, which is to reduce income taxes by 2%. So we can look at it that way, but my own feeling is, if we're talking about it, and in that sense, indeed, as a share of the budget, development expenditure covers quite an extensive amount. And therefore, I like to see the figures there, but we need to see whether these things are being translated in ways where objectives will be met.
Right. Now, you just mentioned about tax, reducing tax. How is this contributing? How will this contribute to the GDP of our country?
One instrument often used is either you increase government expenditure sometimes when you have a slowdown to stimulate GDP growth, but the other is to reduce taxes.
Right.
The other is to reduce taxes so that people will go and spend. Consumer expenditure rises. The concerns you will have then on the second one is whether it will become inflationary.
Yeah.
Now it becomes especially terrible, and something we are anticipating now, stagflation is imminent because of the nature of sanctions imposed by the US and the NATO allies on Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, what that actually means is that we have shortages all over the world, which will have indirect effects on Malaysia, even if it's not direct. And of course, the other important thing is we've faced food inflation, which is reaching something like double of the consumer price index inflation. That's one. Second, we've had a chronic deficit in food trade since 1989. It's never a year where we had a surplus.
Yeah.
So these are concerning points that we'll have to address.
Right. Okay. So now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, moving on with Budget 2023 and to take a look on what are the rests that Budget 2023 that has got to offer us as Malaysians. Back to you, Shuhaida.
Yep, thank you, Brendan. Now we're moving on. Further news update on Budget 2023, where it does not forget to emphasize the importance of building the country's resilience, especially in facing any unexpected circumstances. As such, a total of 36.1 billion ringgit was allocated for the Health Ministry, MOH, as part of the government's efforts in strengthening the public health service capacity to help face the challenges in the future. As compared to the 32.4 billion ringgit received by MOH under Budget 2022, Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul said the ministry received one of the largest increments in allocation among the ministries.
Sungguh pun kita dalam fasa peralihan ke endemik, COVID-19 masih bersama kita. Sejumlah 4.9 bilion ringgit disediakan bagi menampung perolehan seperti ubat, reagen, vaksin dan bahan guna habis, iaitu meningkat 12% berbanding 2022.
He further noted that the priority next year is to upgrade the existing facilities, including older clinics. Therefore, the government has prepared 420 million ringgit to repair hospitals and clinics, as well as replace old equipment, with the priority given to the health facilities in rural areas of Sabah and Sarawak. The government would also use 80 million ringgit to boost the people's health screening agenda through Peduli Kesihatan untuk kumpulan B40 PKB40 initiative. The Education Ministry continues to be among top recipients of Budget 2023 with an allocation of 55.6 billion ringgit compared with 52.6 billion ringgit this year. According to Tengku Datuk Seri Zafar Tunku Abdul Aziz, the government will also be increasing the Bantuan Awal Persekolahan BAP from 100 ringgit to 150 ringgit for all pupils regardless of the income level of parents beginning January next year.
Bagi tahun hadapan 2023, sukacita diumumkan bantuan awal persekolahan akan diberikan kepada semua murid tanpa mengira had pendapatan ibu bapanya. Sebagai contoh, jika sebuah keluarga mempunyai 3 orang anak bersekolah, maka mereka layak menerima BAP sebanyak RM450.
Apart from that, the government would also be increasing the rate of prepared food under the Supplementary Food Programme RMT from RM2.50 to RM3.50 for the Peninsula and RM4 for Sabah, Sarawak and Labuan effective this month.
Salam sejahtera.
The Finance Minister also announced that 2.3 billion ringgit is allocated to provide conducive and safe learning space for school pupils.
Untuk melunaskan amanah besar, ini merupakan peningkatan ketara berbanding peruntukan 1.7 bilion ringgit bagi tahun ini. Dari jumlah tersebut, 1.1 bilion ringgit disediakan untuk kerja-kerja penyelenggaraan dan pembaikan sekolah, merangkumi sekolah kebangsaan, sekolah jenis kebangsaan Cina dan Tamil serta sekolah agama.
He said 1.2 billion ringgit is set aside to upgrade dilapidated schools, especially old wooden building, for the greater comfort of children in Sabah and Sarawak, involving 123 schools in Sabah and 182 schools in Sarawak. To meet the needs of local residents, he said the government will be building 5 new schools costing 430 million ringgit next year in Sabah, Sarawak, Terengganu and Selangor. All right, now explaining further on the matter related to Malaysia's social development, we go back to Brendan and Dr. Raja.
Thank you there, Shu Haida. Now, Prof, yes, here's a question for you that we'd like to get your insights and point of views. Now, according to Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul, GDP has shown signs of improvement post-COVID-19 as the government revised an upward trend of GDP growth for 2022 to be between 6.5 to 7%. Is this an premature measurement? And Professor, do you think that this will definitely be impactful towards fiscal deficit?
Well, my own measure of my own forecast brings, or at least my own position is it should reach around 6 to 6.5%. It may be slightly less than what Tengku Zafrul has forecasted and his team, but it's certainly higher than that of the World Bank. We have to understand that the World Bank's projections, because we had a crash in 2020, they expected a much higher growth rate, a V-shaped recovery, which didn't happen. And in fact, our MOH also seemed to have taken that line and had also a much more belligerent, bullish forecast of that. But except for that, I mean, again, I must say that my projection is not that much different from of what Tengku Zafrul and his team has come out with. But whether it lead to a recession, is that what you're saying? You see, a recession is defined as a phenomena where the economy contracts over 2 quarters. Now, we haven't had a contraction this year yet, and we are not anticipating any crash next year too. In fact, my own impressions are the economy should grow by 4 to 5% next year. That's my position, because our main indicators look fairly good in the sense that even though our international reserves from trade surpluses, current account trade surpluses declined a little bit from the previous month, but it's still quite hefty, quite healthy. Second, our external debt ratio isn't high. It's relatively low, much of our debt, even though it's fairly high, but it's actually denominated in the ringgit. So I'm not expecting a recession.
Right. Now, Prof, a two-part question here. One is concerning the health sector and the other, which you hold really close to your heart, which is education. Now, to start things off, let's talk about the health sector first. It continues to receive one of the highest allocation of 36.1 billion ringgit in allocation to the Health Ministry. Now, this is, of course, to help face the challenges in the future, perhaps the next pandemic. Do you think 36.1 billion ringgit is fairly enough?
Of course, if you ask me, someone who's very concerned about public goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, health is one of them. Because you can't possibly tell when someone is ill whether the person would survive. Yeah. Even a doctor cannot for sure say 100% you would not survive. It's all based on probabilities. Now, with that, I like the fact that it's been increased. But I'm somewhat concerned because I think a lot of the funds are going to private hospitals, right. Tourism and so on. What will happen to the poor? I mean, a typical example scenario will be you may have big hospitals that address the plight of the poor, but you may have queues that might take them 6 months before they actually get an operation, for example.
Right.
Now, should we allow that? So my concern is, while I like that increase, but I would, and of course, including drugs for rare diseases, we call them, drugs to treat them, all that were given. But I do believe that there's a real need to rethink about how we actually figure out the big hospitals, public hospitals. It is to those hospitals the poor would go, the B40.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your insight. Now, moving forward to the Education Ministry, it continues to receive, or rather 55.6 billion ringgit has been targeted to this ministry, to the young generation, of course, school people, seeing that we need to shape the next generation at a young age. What are your point of views on that?
That is, of course, right. I think for very many years, the education specialists who are passionate about education in Malaysia have always talked about how do we encourage thinking-based teaching. Right. I mean, people who can enable their own minds so they become innovative, creative at the same time, rather than undertake rote learning, memorizing things and just vomiting it out during exams. That has been the case, and which is also reflected in the way our children perform in the PISA and TIM scores. We actually perform lower than the Vietnamese. Now, I think that's a good idea, but is that going to translate into transforming the kind of teaching that we will have, including allowing digitalization and digitization, which Tunku Zafrul also talked about, in the way artificial intelligence can be harnessed at the maximum, so that the children at a young age catch the wave of change and they can actually adapt and see what's coming.
Right. So 55.6 billion may be a good figure, but of course, back to you, Shuhaida. Tell us more about Budget 2023.
Yes, thank you, Brandon. Now we're moving on. The country's unemployment rate has declined for 12 consecutive months to 3.7% in July 2022 from 4.8% a year earlier. In continuing this effort, the government will carry on with the implementation of My Step initiative by offering 50,000 career opportunities on a contract basis. This includes 15,000 jobs in the public sector and 35,000 jobs through government-linked companies, GLCs.
Tempoh perkhidmatan My Step sektor awam juga akan dilanjutkan sehingga 31 Disember 2023. Sukacita juga diumumkan bermula tahun 2023, gaji My Step akan dinaikkan sebanyak RM100, iaitu antara RM1,500 hingga RM2,100 berbanding RM1,400 hingga RM2,000.
The Finance Minister also said Keluarga Malaysia will continue to be provided with opportunities to join various programs to improve their skills that will meet the job market demands. The programs include skills training provided by HRD Corp with an allocation of RM750 million to more than 800,000 workers to increase productivity and income opportunities. Malaysia is expecting the arrival of some 15 million foreign tourists with aim to generate 47.6 billion ringgit. To realise this aspiration, 200 million ringgit is allocated for tourism marketing and promotion.
Alhamdulillah, sejak pintu sempadan dibuka, sektor pelancongan sudah mulai pulih. Setakat Julai, Malaysia menerima ketibaan 3.2 juta pelancong dengan pendapatan 9.4 bilion ringgit. Pun begitu, ini masih belum menggambarkan pencapaian sebelum COVID-19, antaranya ekoran dasar Cina yang masih tidak menggalakkan rakyatnya keluar negara. Bagi menggalakkan keluarga Malaysia melancong di destinasi pilihan dalam negara, kerajaan akan memperuntukkan 25 juta ringgit bagi menyediakan insentif kepada rakyat dalam bentuk diskaun, voucher dan rebate bagi penginapan, pakej pelancongan, kraf tangan dan karya seni sehingga RM100.
All right, for more details on the recovery of job market and tourism industry, we go back to Brendan and Dr. Raja.
Thank you there, Shuaida. And of course, employment. We're talking about the unemployment rate, which dropped for 12 months in a row from 4.8% in July 2021 to 3.7% in July 2022. Now, as we move into the endemic stage, the presumption is that job market will recover. Now, Prof, is that realizable looking forward ahead? Because we know lots of companies out there, yes, they are strengthening its growth, but some of them, they are still succumbing to this pressure of the previous movement control order. So, your point of views?
But we can't lie with statistics. I mean, of course, people say that you can lie with statistics, but when we've had an unemployment rate that's fallen from 4.8% to 3.7%, we have to accept that it's actually contracted. But we need to be very clear in terms of what we are trying to expound. And I want to make this point because sometimes the measures that are being taken seem to contradict. One of them is we are giving incentives if the employers are hiring Malaysians rather than foreigners. But then at the same time, we're also hearing we're going to have this many thousand foreign workers that are going to be brought in. We need to be careful because I remember in Taiwan, the minister then was from MIT, he actually imposed in the early 80s a tax on any foreign worker that was brought in, regardless of whether it's a housewife, I mean a maid or someone who worked in the factory. It had a great effect on that. But again, there are a few things you have to take into account. Are we using these interpersonal relationships? Are we working as a network? Are we working as a team? That's very important here because execution requires everyone understanding the direction of what the government wants. And then you'll know this is what you should appropriate. And you must have constant review, though, so that we can continue to recalibrate until we achieve our goals. That was done there. It's just like, are we really connecting Industry 4.0, the robots, drones, and so on, so that we won't have palm oil rotting out there.
Right. Okay. It looks like, first and foremost, thank you so much, Professor, for actually being here. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, and we've reached to the end of this wonderful special edition of News at 10, discussing on Budget 2023.
All right, now, Brendan, and to all of our viewers tonight, wrapping up with a reminder of our top story: responsive, responsible and reformist government unveils Budget 2023.
Exactly. Join us for more updates at 12:30 tomorrow. Till then, I'm Brendan Paul.
And I'm Shuaida Arifin. Thank you for watching.